Vanakkam. Hello friends. In the last episode, we saw about Karigala the Great, the first ruler of the early Cholas who was a true empire builder. Now his contemporaneous king who ruled over the Pandya kingdom was Palsalai Mudukudumi Peruvazhuthi. In his chronology of the early Tamils, K.N. Sivaraja Pillai puts him down as the son of Nedunchezhiyan II, about whom we saw in detail in a previous episode, the king who had many aliases including Nilam Tharu Thiruvil Pandiyan. Now the name Palsalai Mudukudumi Peruvazhuthi itself seems to be a series of epithets, with Vazhuthi and Sezhiyan being the generic name of the early Pandya rulers, Kudumi epitomized victory, Mudukudumi meaning an ancient victorious clan, and in keeping with the poetic convention of those days, probably doesn't reveal the real name of this ruler. Ironically, one of the oldest and longest ruling lineages of this land, the Pandyas, did not deem it necessary to record the proper names of their kings nor the time period during which they ruled. KNS places Mudukudumi Peruvazhuthi between Nedunchezhiyan II and Nedunchezhiyan III, who went by the famed epithet Thalayalanganathu Cheruvendra Pandiyan Nedunchezhiyan. KNS also identifies this Mudukudumi as one and the same as the king who went by the epithet Velliambalathu Thunjiya Peruvazhuthi. The practice of awarding a posthumous title by adding the epithet Thunjiya was a common practice in those days, where Thunjiya, which actually means sleeping, was used in these titles to denote death, and the epithet was coined by including the name of the place where a king had passed away. Hence, Velliambalathu Thunjiya Peruvazhuthi meant the king who met his end at Velliambalam. Similarly, we saw in the previous episode of how Karigala the Great went by the title Kurapalli Thunjiya Perunthiruma Valavan, meaning the king who met his end at Kurapalli. The poet Kari Kannanar of Kaveri Poombattinam sang a poem in Purananuru wherein he sees this king having a tete-a-tete with the great Karigala, and seeing this, the poet records his overwhelming joy and wishes that these two kings remain close forever. Purananuru poem 58 begins, Niye Tanpunal Kaveri Kilavane. O great king, you are the patron of the lands of the river Kaveri, and continues, Niye Aram Tunju Urandai Porunanai. You are the lord of Urandai, where justice resides. Ivane, here referring to Mudukudumi, Nellum Neerum Yellarkum Yeliyena, Varaya Santamum Tiraya Muttamum, Imil Kural Murasum Mundudan Alum, Tamil Kelu Kudal Tankol Vende. He is the king of Kudal, where Tamil flourishes, and where he rules with his just scepter, where water and grains are plentiful. He rules with the resounding 3 drums in a city that gets sandalwood from the mountains and precious pearls from the seas. And the poem continues, Paal nira uruvin panai kodiyonum, Neel nira uruvin nemiyonum என்று இரு பெருந்தெய்வமும் உடன் நின்றா அங்கு உருகெழு தோற்றமோடு உட்குவர விளங்கி இன்னீர் ஆகலின் இனியவும் உளவோ. You too are like the great gods, the one with the Palmyra flag, the white-skinned Balarama, and the one who wields the discus, the blue-skinned Thirumal. Together you shine and strike terror in the hearts of enemies. Innum Kenmin, listen to more, may your fame flourish forever. If you help each other and do not ruin this unity, you will win this beneficial world that is surrounded by oceans. So be good and fair to each other. Pay attention to the path that your ancestors took. May your unity continue like today, and do not pay heed to strangers who come between you. Adugalathu uyarganum vele, Koduvari Kolman Queendra Senvilangu Todupuri, Nedanir Kendayodu, Poritta Kudumiya Aha, Pirar Kundrukelu Nade. May your spears see victory after victory in murderous battles, and may you conquer the mountains and embellish them with the symbols of both the tiger emblemed Cholas and the carp fish of the Pandyas. So, times must have been a changing for a poet to again and again reiterate that these two kings stand united, and we find a similar theme in other Puram poems as well. For instance, one in where Avvayar sees the three kings together asking the great three to maintain their unity at all times. So, forces must have been coming into the Tamil country, divisive forces that were about to challenge and change the order of things. Nummidai puharku alamalarum ஏதில் மாக்கள் பொதுமொழி கொள்ளாது. ஏதில் மாக்கள். Who were these strangers whom the bards feared would come in between two rulers? Not only that, probably they feared that these strangers would come between them and their patron kings. In Madurai Kanji, that sings the fame of Thalayalanganathu Cheruvendra Pandiyan Nedunchezhiyan, the poet Mangudi Maruthanar sings about two of his ancestors, his father Palsale Mudukudumi Peruvazhuthi and his grandfather Nedunchezhiyan II. About Mudukudumi, the poet sings, Kalamdorum Kallarippa Maramdorum Mai Veelpa Nina Oon Suttu Urukkameya Neikanindu Varayarpa Kuruvu Kuipugai Malai Mangulin Parandu Thondra Viyal Nagaral Palsale Mudukudumiyin Nalvelvi Thurai Pogiya. With the abundant flow of toddy, there is celebration going on where numerous goats are sacrificed and are being cooked in open stubs under trees, where their flesh oozes as it is cooked in oil, and the clouds of smoke that are emitted from these stubs spread in all directions like the fame of Mudukudumi. May you follow in his footsteps. Here, Velvi simply meant a sacrifice, and here it clearly indicates the animal sacrifice of the goat, which could have had a ritualistic connotation. They were probably performed to commemorate fallen heroes who protected a clan, maybe in association with a hero stone worship, a Nadugal Vazhipadu, as was common practice in that ancient era. But commentators like Nachinar Iniyar, who belong to the 14th century, who come way after a time period of when the poem was actually composed, bring in their own connotation influenced by practices of their time. And so, Nachinar Kiniyar here writes that Velvi meant the Vedic Homa ritual, and the king who went by the name Palsale Mudukudumi Peruvazhuthi has his name altered to Palyagasale Mudukudumi Peruvazhuthi. A mischievous spin points out KNS. Not only that, KNS also points out how the term Sale originally meant a cave of beds to which Buddhists or other monks retreated during times of meditation and rest. So, one might consider Palsale Mudukudumi meaning the Pandya king who created many such cave beds for the wandering monks of these heretic faiths, which were quite popular down south during that time period. So, the word yaga could have been added to the name of this king, making Palsale Mudukudumi as Palyagasale Mudukudumi. By later Vedic traditions that wanted to project on a much earlier Pandya king the significance of Vedic rituals and to imply the antiquity of such rituals. Mangudi Maruthanar continues to sing the praise of Nedunchezhiyan II, the grandfather of Thalayalanganathu Cheruvendra Pandiyan, and he sings, Thol Aanai Nallasiriyar Punarkootunda Pugalsal Sirappin Nilantaru Thiruvin Nediyon Pola Viyappum Salbum Semmai Saanror Palarvai Pugararu Sirappin Thondri. These verses convey a very straightforward meaning that the Pandya king Nilantaru Thiruvir Pandiyan had gathered wisdom and knowledge by convening a gathering of wise and learned men in his court, and Mangudi Maruthanar wishes that Nedunchezhiyan III continue this practice. Here again, later commentators feel free to add their own interpretations, with Nachinar Kiniyar establishing Nilantaru Thiruvin Nediyon to mean Thirumal, and some other commentators adding that he retrieved the Pandya land lost to the seas and that he established a Tamil Sangam, with some even claiming that Tolgapiyar's Tolgapiyam was published in this Sangam. Ironic how these later commentaries challenge the very basic spirit of the Sangam era poems, which is to stick to reality. Nettimayar, who was a lady poet contemporaneous to Palsale Mudukudumi, sings in the Puram poem 12, Panar Thamarai Malayavum Pulavar, Poonudal Yanayodu Punaither Pannavum, Arano Mattu Idu Viranman Kudumi, Inna Aha Pirar Mankondu, Iniya Seidin in Arvalar Muhatte. Vanja Puhalchi is a term used when a poet praises a king but indirectly is chiding him. Here, Nettimayar pulls up the king and questions his righteousness in routing enemy territories and plundering their wealth, and then offering them in all generosity to the bards who sing his praise. He offers them garlands that are made of silver strands wherein are tied golden lotuses. He offers them bedecked elephants and chariots to ride. But all this wealth comes out of destruction. Is this fair, O Kudumi? The poet asks. Again, in Purananuru poem 15, Nettimayar chides Mudukudumi for causing destruction of enemy territories, where the poem begins, Kadanther Kudithan Yellal Angan, Velvai Kaludai Pul Inapputti Parseidane. In rage, O king, you ploughed the enemy's fertile agricultural fields with donkeys, and you let your chariots, being led by strong horses, into these fields where the horses' hooves destroyed the crops. Not only that, you let your elephants wade through the precious drinking water resources of the enemy's land, making them unfit to drink. And the poem continues, Vilangu Ponnerinda Nalam Kilar Palhayodu, Nidal Padu Nedivel Yendi, ஒன்னார் ஒன்படை கடுந்தார் முன்பு தலைக்கொன்மார் நசைதர வந்தோர் நசை பிறர் கொழிய வசைப்பட வாழ்ந்தோர் பலர்கொல். Given your terrible rage, which one of these was great in number? The enemy soldiers who fought with shining spears but who didn't lose their life in battle and had to live with the shame of being defeated by you, or புரையில் நற்பணுவல் நால் வேதத்து அருஞ்சீர்த்தி பெரும் கண்ணுரை நெய்மலி ஆவுதி பொங்க பன்மான் வீயா சிறப்பின் வேள்வி முற்றி யூபம் நட்ட வியன்களம் பலகொல் யாபல கொல்லோ பெரும. Or the number of huge fields where you have planted columns forming faultless rituals prescribed by the 4 good Vedas, which was more. Now this is the interpretation given by the few commentators that I read, and there seems to be no logic in comparing two unrelated parameters: defeated soldiers living in shame or the number of Vedic sacrificial pits that you made. No correlation whatsoever. But if we reinterpret the lines, Viya Chirappin Velvi Mutri, Yubam Natta Viyankalam Palakol, Velvi meaning sacrifice, the term Yubam meant a post to which the victim to be sacrificed was tied up. It also meant the headless trunk of a body. The following verses in Madurai Kanji describe a horrific post-war scene. Pinayubam எழுந்தாட அஞ்சு வந்த போர்க்களத்தான் ஆண் தலை அணங்கடுப்பின் வயவேந்தர் ஒன்குருதி சினத்தியின் பேர்பு பொங்க. In the battlefield, the Tunangai Kuthu, the war dance, is being conducted by the Gauls, and the headless trunks of fallen soldiers get up and dance in glee. Making a stove out of the heads of the fallen soldiers, the blood of fallen heroes was used to cook with the flames of anger, and an offering was made. So reinterpreting the lines of Nettimayar, which was more, those who lived in shame after surviving the defeat in war, or Viya Chirappin Velvi Mutri, Yubam Natta Viyankalam Palakol, or the number of those headless bodies of soldiers lying slain around in the battlefield. So which was more? A more meaningful rendering. Then again the words Purayil Narpanuval Nal Vedattu, meaning the good words of the 4 Vedas. Could this line be a later insertion, or could they have been misread, a pada bedam from the original text? Well, KNS opines that this should have been a later insertion and claims how quite a few poems of the Sangam works had been tampered with. He says, and I quote, "To add to the general suspicion regarding the yagas, none of the longer compositions such as Puranarattupadai, Pattinappalai and Madurai Kanji has a word to say about such rites. If those kings had really celebrated the yagas, the contemporary poets would certainly have described them in these longer compositions. Their silence regarding this Vedic rite, a new introduction in the Tamil land, is inexplicable. Moreover, the conditions of that period do not seem to favor any such religious activity." Again, many a wrongful interpretation by these later commentators seems to have biased the scholars who came later on. The verses from the Madurai Kanji end with the lines, "Tennavan periya tunnaruntuppin, Tolmudu kadavul pinnar meya, Varaithal aruvi porupin poruna." Tennavan, the Pandya king, who resides in the land of the ancient nameless gods, where waterfalls abound falling from high mountains. But all the commentators go on to interpret these simple verses to mean Tennavan as Lord Shiva, making out the Pandyas to come from the genealogy of the Lord himself, which actually makes no sense. And the commentator Nachinar Kiniyar goes one step further and identifies Tennavan with Ravana, the mountains with Podiyal hills, and the Tolmudu Kadavul with Ahathiyar, and gives his own explanation, which I will not go into here. But this is how even an authentic source of history can be misinterpreted to fit later narratives. In the previous episode on Karikala the Great, remember we saw about his uncle Irumbidar Talayar, who helped him in capturing the seat of Urandai, this Irumbidar Talayar being an important court officer of Palsale Mudukudumi. Interestingly, there is a poem in Purananoru sung by Irumbidar Talayar, from which we know that this was not his actual name, but was picked up from a phrase that occurred in the poem itself. And the poem goes, "Uvavumadi uruvi ongal venkudai, Nilavugadal Varaipin Mannaha Nilatra." Like the rising full moon, your parasol, the Venkotra Kudai, stands tall as a mountain, protecting the lands bordered by the seas. Perungai Yane Irumbidar Talayirundu, Marundil Kuttat Tarundolil Saya, Karungai Olval Perumbeyer Valuthi, Nilam Peyarinum Nin Sol Peyaral. O Valuthi of great fame, with a gleaming black iron sword in your hands, wielding the sword, you look like Kutruvan, the god of death, striking terror in your enemies' hearts as you ride your big strong royal elephant. Nilam Perinum Nin Sol Peral. The earth may move, but may your words be immovable. Karungai Volval, meaning the hand that held the black iron sword, and though some later commentators have identified this to be another Pandya king, KNS is very clear that it referred to Palsale Mudukudumi, given that Irumbidar Talayar was a chieftain of his court. Again, to remind ourselves as to why we are following the genealogy tables given by KNS, not many historians have dealt in detail with the early lineages of the triumvirate, given the lack of sources other than that of the Sangam literary works to correlate pieces of history. For instance, in his book The Pandyas, the noted historian Nilaganda Sastri, he dedicates about 11 pages out of 256 in the book to tracing the history of the early Pandyas, wherein again in the post-Sangam era, mythical genealogies come into play in not only literary works, but even in later copperplate inscriptions. For instance, the bilingual copperplates of Velvikudi, issued by the medieval Pandya king Jadila Parantakan around the 7th century Common Era, talk about Mudukudumi. These plates were supposed to have been discovered at Madakulam near Madurai, as per the records of the British Museum's Indian charters on copperplates. with inscriptions in Sanskrit and Tamil. The Sanskrit portions give the mythical genealogies of the Pandyas. The mythical genealogy makes the Pandyas the descendants of Lord Shiva, while the Tamil portion sticks to historical facts. The Velvikudi Cheppedu talks about how a Brahmadeyam, a land grant, was made to a Brahmin priest named Narkotran, probably the first extant record of a Brahmadeyam. The exact location of the place Velvikudi itself being not identifiable, it should have been somewhere near Korkai, as both Velvikudi and Korkai formed a part of the same Kurram, a division of fertile villages known as Pahanur Kurram. The Brahmins of this Kurram seem to have gone to the medieval Pandya ruler Jadila Parantakan and made a demand that these lands had been offered as Brahmadeyam to their ancestor Narkotran for having performed a Velvi, a Yagna, for whom Palsale Mudukudumi, and here in this copper plate the king's name is mentioned as Palyaga Mudukudumi, wherein for the first time the term Sale is replaced with Yaga. And Jadila Parandagan actually reinstitutes the Brahmadeyam. Imagine, after a gap of almost 6 centuries, with the Kalabra rule happening in the interregnum, the Pandya king reinstituting the Brahmadeyam goes to show the influence that the Brahmin priesthood must have enjoyed in the courts of the Pandya rulers of those medieval times. So, combining Palyaga and Sale, the king becomes known as Palyaga Sale Mudukudumi Peruvazhuthi, falsifying history and altering a king's name. We will continue exploring the rule of the early triumvirate in the coming episodes. Vanakkam.